Hello, ladies and gentlemen, guys and gals. This is Dylan Fletcher of Fletcher Knives. You'll have to excuse the way I sound. I have a very serious sinus infection right now, so my nasal passages in my throat are absolutely on fire. So I've been asked several times to do a video on how I do my pin layouts, and how exact are they? Because there's a lot of people, especially new knife makers, that are kind of eyeballing where their pins need to be, and honestly, if it's a fellow knife maker or a discerning knife customer who's looking at your handle, they're going to know right off the bat if you did this a professional way or if you just shot from the hip. I mean, it stands out from a mile away. For those of you who think you're getting away with eyeballing stuff, you're not. Sorry. That's just how it works. So, here's a way that I do it where it comes out pretty precise. The tools that you're going to need to do this are a decent caliper. If you don't have one of these, it's worth the expense. If you're going to be making knives, even as a hobby maker, you need to have a caliper. So if you don't have one, you can get one on Amazon. Don't get just a super cheap thing. They're going to fall apart. You need to get one that's kind of decent. And keep it in the case when you're not using it. Don't let your caliper get damaged. You're also going to need a punch of some sort that you can make a little pilot dent with for your drill press. Whether it be one of these or a spring-loaded punch. If you're going to be using one of these like I do, you will require a hammer. You're also going to need a ruler, and you're going to need a Sharpie that has a good tip on it. If you don't have one that has a good tip, go buy a new Sharpie. You need to have Sharpies with new tips. Okay, so the first thing that you need to understand about your pin layout is that there's more that you need to take into consideration than just, do they look good? For example, when you're talking about your top pin and where that's going to be, you need to have the correct spacing between your top pin and the top of your actual handle scales that allow you to put a clamp on there during the glue up process. And it can't be impeded by this pin, and it can't impede your ability to clean the top of these scales and get all that epoxy off when it starts squeezing out after you're clamping your clamps on. So you need to leave enough room in between that and your top of your scales to accommodate that clamp. Once you have that figured out, you put a dot. Now this dot doesn't have to be exactly in the middle or anything like that. What you're doing is you're just remembering where you're making all your measurements off of. Now once you know where that top pin needs to be, you need to take your caliper and you need to measure the width of the tang. Oh, excuse me, this is not easy to do with one hand. So you need to measure the width of the tang. Anyways, right there. I'm not trying to open this thing up anymore. You need to measure the width of the tang right there, divide it in half, lock your caliper, scribe a line at the top, scribe a line at the bottom. Trust your caliper. Don't look at that and say, oh man, I think I messed that up or something. If you divided that in half perfectly, you're going to end up with your lines in the place where they need to be. So once you have that, that shows you exactly where the center line of your tang is going to be and will allow you to space your dots off of that. Okay, now once you have your center line, the next thing that you need to do is you need to figure out what your spacing between your pins is going to be. Now, some people will just stick a dot on here somewhere where it looks good, and then they'll measure it with a ruler and divide it in half. Well, sometimes you end up with some math that's just slightly more complicated than it has to be. Pick some pin spacing that makes sense and is something that you can do quickly. For example, I know that the pin spacing on a handle this size can be about 3 inches and it'll look perfect. And so what I did was I took my ruler, laid it up there, and measured out 3 inches. It's real easy to do, 1.5 inches in between. And where these dots are is actually slightly more toward the spine than they are to the front. Now the reason for that is because after you're done shaping this handle, you should end up with somewhat of an egg shape somehow or another. Now whether that be facets or just rounded over, it doesn't matter. Your handle should be slightly skinnier on the front than it is on the back. And that will give you the correct handle shape. It's called the egg shape, and it's the professional way to do your handles. So if you have your dots exactly in the middle or slightly toward the front, you're going to be able to see that. If they're perfectly in the middle, when your handle is shaped, it's going to create an optical illusion to where your pins look like they're actually slightly closer to the front than they are to the back. And that has to do with the way that the angles go as your handle is rolling over toward the front. So what you can do is just space them slightly more toward the rear, and I'm talking slightly like as in a millimeter or two. They're super small. And that way, when you get all your handle shaped and everything, they end up being perfectly centered. On a handle like this, you'll see that this rear hole is noticeably slightly closer to the back than it is to the front. Now that's another thing to take into consideration, because this handle has facets. There's going to be a flat facet that runs down here. Now if I space this lanyard tube a little bit more in the center than right here, by the time this facet is in, part of this lanyard tube is going to be overlapping this facet, and so you're going to end up with a tube where most of it's flat on the top and then a tiny bit is dipped down. That looks stupid. So I move that slightly further back, it's going to hit that facet perfect, and then I have nothing to worry about. I'm not going to end up with a goofy looking pinout. So that's a good thing to get in the habit of, is just spacing it slightly back toward the rear part of the tang. Okay, if you happen to put these dots a little too close to the front, it is going to stand out like a sore thumb from miles away. Any knife maker, any discerning knife customer, anything like that is going to be able to see it right off the bat. It's going to be a flaw. It looks stupid. Don't do that. You need to make sure that these things are spaced correctly from the front of the tang so that they look like they're exactly in the center like they're supposed to be. Okay, so once you have that figured out, and you know what your spacing on your dots and everything needs to be, and you get those marked, you take your punch and you just stick it on there and whack it with a hammer or whatever you do and make your pilot dents. Now once you do that, you can check to make sure that they look good. And the way that you do that is you take your handle, so I've got a dent there, and one at the back, and you can tilt it up. And you can see what that looks like to see if you're happy, you know, if they curve, if they're supposed to be straight, whatever. You can look at that when you tilt it up and see if you're happy with the way that it looks. Now if you have more than 3 pins, like you're using 4 or something like that, when you tilt it up like this, if they're out of line, or you got one that goes up and then comes back down and then back up, you're going to be able to see it. It's going to look stupid. It's going to look dumb when the knife is done. So don't do that. Tilt this thing up, look down the line, and make sure that it looks good. Because if it doesn't look good, your knife sucks. Okay, once you have all that done, it's fairly simple. You go over to your drill press and you drill the holes. Now, if you're doing 1/4 inch, well, really any kind of size hole that you're doing, I highly recommend that you get a drill bit for drilling your tangs that is slightly larger than the outer diameter of your pin. When you're doing things like taper tang and stuff like that, even when you're just doing a glue up on a normal knife, it's going to make it a lot easier to get your pins in this handle material through the tang and everything than it would be if you try to do the inner diameter of your drill holes in your tang the exact outer diameter of your pin material. And so I actually use a 6.5 instead of a 1/4 inch to do these, and that thing works out perfect. It gives me enough space to where when I'm pushing my pins through, they go through nice and easy. It's not a big deal. If you're going to be using an 1/8 inch hole for doing 1/8 inch pins in your handle material, again, you would slightly step it up to where you were using like a couple of millimeters larger than you need to just to drill your tang. Okay, another thing that you need to do is when you're drilling these tangs, try to use as new a drill bit as you can. I mean, if you have a whole bunch of drill bits and you got some that are worn out, use the worn out drill bits for doing lightening holes, holes that are used to lighten the tang in your knife and better balance it out. Use the newer drill bits to drill these holes, because you don't want a whole bunch of like crap coming up over the edges of the holes, and you're also going to chamfer the holes when you're done. And that's pretty much it. If you got any questions or anything, let me know. I'm always willing to help everybody out, and I'll catch you in the next video. Peace. See, here's one that looks like it could throw you off. So down at the bottom, that hole is going to be slightly more toward the front. That one's pretty well centered, and that one looks like it's up toward the back a little bit. However, if I take this handle and I tilt it so that you can see, those things are lining up beautifully. That is like a beautiful constellation of where my drill holes are going to be. So that's ideal. That's what you're aiming for. You're aiming for precision and aesthetics all at the same time, because nothing looks better than something that's perfectly laid out.